Mercedes won the first race of the new era, and somehow that only made Formula One look more unstable. George Russell put the new rules on pole, led Mercedes to a 1-2 with Kimi Antonelli in Melbourne, and still left the weekend surrounded by a question nobody expected this early. Why did the team that looked most in control arrive at the exact moment the whole sport started doubting the cars themselves? Ferrari stayed close enough to keep the pressure on, McLaren sounded the alarm, and Red Bull made the unease impossible to ignore, because this was never just about who won on Sunday. The proof came fast. Melbourne was the first real test of these 2026 machines under race pressure, and the picture it gave the paddock was messy. Drivers were managing energy far earlier than anyone wanted. The active aero was changing the feel of the car. And the new power balance made even simple wheel-to-wheel moments feel strange. Lando Norris called them the worst cars he has driven, while Russell sounded far calmer after taking pole and winning. But here's what the paddock is not talking about. The FIA already had fixes in reserve before the season even began, and that changes the whole meaning of what Melbourne really was, because once you know the governing body had backup plans ready, the opening race stops looking like a surprise and starts looking like a gamble. Nicholas Tombazis has already signaled that changes could be reviewed straight after China, which means this story is moving much faster than most fans realize. That is where this story gets complicated. If Mercedes has understood the rules better than anyone else, any fix could reshape the title fight before the season has even settled. And before anyone decides whether Melbourne was a warning or a full-blown design problem, the race that really matters is the one that comes next. Melbourne was supposed to calm the noise around the new rules. It did the opposite. Mercedes left with the win, Ferrari left knowing it had real pace, and McLaren and Red Bull left with far bigger concerns than a single result. The race looked busy, dramatic, almost chaotic, but the real story was never about the lap time. It was about how the racing felt. Cars were not attacking corners and straights in a natural rhythm. They were constantly juggling charge, drag, and deployment, and for fans watching live, that tension was impossible to miss. By Sunday night, the opening round had already turned into a test of the whole 2026 vision. That shift became impossible to ignore once the numbers met the driver reaction. Formula One highlighted an overtake count that was almost 3 times higher than the same event a year earlier, but the spectacle did not feel clean. George Russell won from pole and looked composed. Charles Leclerc finished on the podium and knew Ferrari had missed a bigger chance. And Lewis Hamilton made it clear over the radio that key calls had hurt the team. Then came Lando Norris saying these were the worst cars he had driven. That was not heat of the moment frustration. That was a reigning champion telling the sport its biggest redesign still had a serious weakness. And that is why Melbourne changed everything. A bad first race can be explained away. A first race that makes drivers question how they have to drive cannot. The debate moved in one weekend from performance to identity. Were these cars simply rough around the edges, or had Formula One built a rules package that was already fighting its own purpose? Nobody in that garage expected what came next, because the moment the FIA began signaling that changes were already on the table, Melbourne stopped being the opener and became the evidence, which is exactly why the story now turns to what the FIA knew before the lights ever went out. The FIA did not walk out of Melbourne shocked. That is the part most people missed. While fans were still arguing over whether the opening race had exposed a weak start or a deeper flaw, Nicholas Tombazis was already speaking like a man who had seen this storm forming well before the weekend began. That changes the mood of the whole story. If the people writing and policing these rules already had backup ideas in mind, then the first race was not just a live test. It was also a decision to wait, watch, and let the evidence land in public before touching anything at all. That waiting game matters more than it looks. Tombazis made it clear that the FIA wanted real race data before reacting, and that all 10 teams were aligned on avoiding a rushed move before Melbourne. On the surface, that sounds sensible. Teams needed to see the cars over a full Grand Prix distance, not just over testing laps in Bahrain, but the data tells a completely different story once you look at the timing. The FIA had enough concern to prepare possible adjustments early, yet still chose not to act before the first lights out of the new era. which means this was as much a political calculation as a technical one. And that is where the pressure starts building on a different level. A quiet adjustment after China can be sold as smart management. A visible correction right after Melbourne can also look like an admission that the sport launched too early with unanswered questions. That is why Japan suddenly matters so much, because it is close enough for a quick intervention, but late enough for the FIA to say the process was measured, not panicked. The problem is that once you accept a change is possible, the next fight is no longer about whether to act. It is about which fix they choose first. The first real escape route is not a new engine, a new car, or some massive redesign. It is software. That is why option A matters so much. On the FIA's quickest move is raising super clipping, which would let the cars recover more energy while the driver stays on throttle instead of constantly backing out and bleeding speed in all the wrong places. On paper, that sounds small. In practice, it could change the way the whole race looks and feels, because if the driver can stay committed for longer, the car stops behaving like it is punishing aggression every time the battery math turns ugly. This is also the cleanest fix because it does not ask teams to rip up their whole package. McLaren had already been pushing this line, and Andrea Stella made it clear that urgent changes were needed on both sporting and safety grounds. That matters. When a top team boss starts framing the issue that way, the conversation moves beyond preference and into necessity. Oh, what no broadcast covered is this. The appeal of this option is not just speed, it is politics. A software adjustment is far easier to sell than a deeper rewrite and far easier to deliver before the season slips further into a pattern nobody wants. But this is where the easy answer stops looking easy. A cleaner harvest phase does not automatically mean better racing. It may hide the problem more smoothly, yet still leave the car giving away speed at the wrong moments, just in a less obvious way than before. So even if option A arrives first, it may only soften the sharpest edge instead of fixing the root issue. And once that doubt enters the room, the next conversation becomes far more dangerous for the FIA, because the second option asks the sport to give up part of the very idea it spent years trying to build. The second fix is far more uncomfortable because this time the FIA would not be smoothing the problem over. It would be admitting the cars are asking for more electrical deployment than the racing can truly support. Option B means cutting that deployment back, letting the battery last longer, and stopping those brutal drops where one car suddenly has power and another does not. That would make the flow of a lap more stable. It would make the racing feel less random, but it would also force Formula 1 to step away from one of the biggest selling points of this entire rules era, and that is where the tension really starts. For years, the sport presented 2026 as a bold new balance between electric power and the combustion engine. That was part of the pitch, part of the identity, part of why this generation was supposed to feel different from what came before. So if the FIA now reduces deployment to protect the spectacle, the message changes overnight. The data tells a completely different story. This would not be a small tune-up, it would be a quiet retreat from the original vision. Teams could accept it if it helps the racing, but manufacturers would immediately start looking at who gains, who loses, and whose package was built around an electrical target that suddenly moves. That is why option B carries more risk than option A ever could. A software tweak can be framed as refinement. A cut to deployment feels like the sport blinking first. It tells the paddock that the opening concept may have been too ambitious for the real demands of a Grand Prix weekend. And once that possibility becomes real, the conversation stops being about smoothing the edges and starts becoming about protecting the season itself. Because if reducing electric power still does not cure the problem, then the FIA is left staring at the one move nobody wants to admit is even possible. The third option is the one Formula 1 does not want to say out loud for too long, because once it becomes serious, the whole shape of this rules era starts to bend. If the FIA has to lean back on the combustion engine and pull the balance away from the electrical side, then this stops being a rescue plan and starts becoming a rewrite of the promise itself. That is why option C feels so heavy. This is not about smoothing deployment or adjusting software behavior. This is about the sport admitting that the new formula may need more old school power just to protect the quality of the racing. What makes this even more sensitive is the timing around the calendar. Bahrain and Saudi Arabia are no longer just normal stops on the schedule. Their place in the spring run has come under real pressure, and that creates a strange opening for the FIA. What no broadcast covered is this. Extra space between races would give the governing body and the teams more time to study the data, model the consequences, and build a wider response without the next weekend crashing straight into them. That sounds useful, but it also also means the crisis has room to grow because a longer gap invites deeper questions from teams, drivers, and manufacturers about what 2026 is really supposed to be. And that is why option C changes the emotional weight of the whole story. The first two fixes still let the FIA argue that the concept is sound and only needs adjustment. This one does not. This one forces the sport to ask whether its new direction can survive without backing away from its own central idea. That is a much bigger problem than one messy Sunday in Melbourne, because once the calendar and the regulations start pulling on each other at the same time, the next race is no longer just another round of the championship. It becomes the test that decides how far this rescue mission really has to go. Shanghai is where the excuses run out. Melbourne gave the sport shock, noise, and confusion, but China offers something far more dangerous, a cleaner answer. This circuit asks different questions of the car. The long back straight still punishes weak energy use, but the heavier braking zones give teams more chances to recover what they lose. That matters because if the 2026 package looks calmer here, the FIA can argue Melbourne exposed an extreme case. If it looks broken again, then the problem is no longer tied to one track. It is built into the way these cars live over a lap, and everybody in the paddock knows it. That is why every front-running team arrives at Shanghai under a different kind of pressure. Mercedes wants proof that its Melbourne edge came from understanding the rules better than anyone else, not from surviving a strange opener more cleanly than the rest. Ferrari needs to show that its pace can still translate once the track demands a different rhythm from the power unit. McLaren needs the race to confirm that its warnings were real and not just frustration after a bad feeling weekend. Red Bull wants evidence that its concerns were not overblown. The real story was never about the lap time. It was about whether these cars can race naturally when the circuit gives them a fairer chance. And that makes China the race that will force the next move. If drivers can attack with more confidence, if the battery stops deciding too many fights, and if the gaps make sense from corner to corner, the FIA gains room to stay calm. But if the same strange rhythm shows up again, then every soft explanation starts collapsing at once. Shanghai will not just shape the next fix, it will shape how the whole opening phase of 2026 is remembered, which is why the final question is now unavoidable. When the evidence is complete, what exactly is Formula One willing to sacrifice to save its new era? Formula One can still steady this season, but not without choosing what it is willing to give up first. That is the truth hiding underneath all three options. If the FIA pushes the quick software route, it protects the idea of 2026 and hopes the racing starts to breathe again. If it cuts deployment harder, it protects the flow of the Grand Prix, but weakens the identity of the rules package it spent years building. If it ever reaches for more combustion power, then the sport is no longer refining a new formula, it is stepping back from it. By this point, the fight is not just about solving a problem, it is about deciding which version of Formula One deserves to survive. That is why the voices around this story matter so much. George Russell gave Mercedes the perfect opening result and made calm look possible. Lando Norris gave the frustration a champion's weight. Max Verstappen turned the discomfort into a warning the sport could not shrug off. Andrea Stella pushed the case for action from the pit wall side, while Nicolas Tombazis became the man responsible for proving that patience was not a misread. And that is where this story gets complicated. Every one of those voices is reacting to the same cars, yet each one is describing a different future, and the FIA now has to pick which future it believes in. So this is where the whole thing lands. Shanghai decides whether Melbourne was the first bruise of a rough new era or the first clear sign that the design itself needs surgery. After that, the rescue plan stops being theory and becomes policy. As the teams will adapt, the drivers will adjust, and the championship will keep moving, but the meaning of 2026 will not be decided by the launch graphics or the rulebook promises. It will be decided by how much of the original vision Formula One has to cut away just to make the racing feel real again.